Many people believe that the 9/11 attacks were orchestrated by the United States itself. Some believe to convince the public the invasion of Iraq was justified, others believe to further the military-industrial complex, along with numerous other reasons. I won't be talking about the specific details of the 9/11 attacks, just how the U.S. government has set a precedent of false flag operations, showing that we shouldn't be totally convinced by the U.S. government's explanation of any event, much less a horrific, fear-invoking attack, remembering that fear is the strongest emotion, and emotions compel decisions more than logic. First, let's define false flag operations, as it may be a new term to most people. They're not pushing this stuff in schools. According to Wikipedia, a false flag operation is an act committed with the intent of disguising the actual source of responsibility and pinning blame on another party. With just a little contrarian thinking, you can see how this can be tied to 9/11 attacks, but I'll dive deeper to show you how far the U.S. government is truly willing to go. I'll begin with false flags operations carried outside of the U.S. by its enemies. Let's remember that none of this information is 100% verifiable, but I've tried my best to come up with clear evidence that is unlikely to be U.S. propaganda. November 1939, the Soviet Union shelled one of their own towns on the border of Finland. Shortly after, they executed swift operations to invade Finland on the premise that they attacked the Soviet Union. This operation was possibly the most idiotic thing the Soviets could have done, as it was easily proven that none of the Finnish artillery battalions had the capabilities to reach the Soviet town, and the Soviet Union was also humiliatingly defeated in the war. But these are just the dirty comics, right? Of course they do something like this, but not our God-fearing U.S. government, right? Wrong. Let's start with OperationNorthwoods, which thankfully was vetoed by John F. Kennedy, but before that it made its way all the way up the chain of command and was approved by everyone besides the president himself. This operation was proposed to create attacks on U.S. civilians and military personnel, seemingly from Cuban nationals, to justify a Cuban invasion. It details in 11 steps how the U.S. could establish a credible enough attack to justify the U.S. invasion of Cuba. 1. Start rumors. 2. Land friendly Cubans in uniforms over the fence to stage attack on base. Base in this reference is all on the U.S. base in Guantanamo Bay, which is in Cuba, still is, but today it's used as like a prison where they're allowed to do war crimes, but that's a different video altogether. 3. Capture Cuban-friendly saboteurs inside the base, start riots near the base main gate with friendly Cubans, these people on their side, blow up their own ammunition inside the base, start fires, burn their own aircraft on the base, lob mortar shells from outside of the base into the base, damage their base, and then it keeps going on, basically causing lots of damage to the base. The next 2 steps, execute offensive operations against the sovereign nation of Cuba and commence large-scale United States operations, aka the invasion of Cuba. It also proposes domestic terror attacks inside of the United States. And number 4, it says, develop a communist Cuban terror campaign in the Miami area and other Florida cities and even Washington. It states, we could sink a boatload of Cubans en route to Florida, real or simulated, which answers the question if they would kill for this operation. Also, they could, quote, explode a few plastic bombs in carefully chosen spots. A few U.S. lives can be spared in the name of freedom, right? This memorandum also states they could recreate the Remember the Maine incident, in which the USS Maine mysteriously exploded near Cuba in 1898, resulting in 261 U.S. fatalities, which prompted the saying, remember the Maine, and justified the Spanish-American War. Interestingly, it seems to be debated if this was a false flag operation, but its presence in this document seems to be evidentiary that it was to me. This incident was heavily reported on in 2 of the largest newspapers of the time, the New York Journal and the New York World, owned by William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer. Pulitzer later said, nobody outside of a lunatic asylum really believed that Spain sanctioned Maine's destruction. Starting to see how the propaganda machine works? Just a few years later, we saw the GulfOfTonkin incident. In the GulfOfTonkin incident, there were supposedly 2 attacks. The first attack, which most certainly did happen, was largely predictable. The U.S. destroyer Maddox was patrolling inside of the 14-mile limit the North Vietnamese had claimed, but this limit was unrecognized by the United States. Sounds like they were provoking an attack to me. The Maddox was hit by 1 machine gun shell from a North Vietnamese boat, suffered minimal damage, and returned to South Vietnamese water. Then there was supposedly a second attack. During a time of horrible weather on the sea, 2 U.S. ships fired blindly at targets they saw only on radar and maneuvered vigorously. They stated to have sunk 2 North Vietnamese boats despite there being 0 evidence of any sunken boats. It was probably the bad weather, washed it up on shore or something, right? Within 30 minutes of the second attack, President Johnson had decided on retaliatory attacks. That same day, he used the hotline to Moscow and assured the Soviets that he had no intent in opening a broader war in Vietnam. Sure, buddy. According to a CIA analyst from 1963 to 1990, the CIA, not to mention President Johnson, Defense Secretary Robert McNamara, and National Security Advisor McGeorge Bundy, all knew full well that the evidence of any armed attack on the evening of August 4th, the so-called second attack, was highly dubious. According to a former U.S. Navy analyst, the primary purpose of the Maddox was to act as a seagoing provocateur, to poke its sharp gray bow in the American flag as close to the belly of North Vietnam as possible, in effect shoving its 5-inch cannons up the nose of the Communist Navy. It really seems like they are provoking now. 6 days after the supposedly second attack, the Gulf of Tonkin resolution was passed, giving U.S. President Lyndon B. Johnson authorization, without a formal declaration of war by Congress, to use conventional military force in Southeast Asia. Seems a little contradictory to the way the Founding Fathers wanted Congress's power to declare war and check the president. But we can't have checks and balances in the pursuit of global freedom. Later, the former Secretary of Defense at the time stated, "I think it's now clear the second attack did not occur." I don't know which one's scarier, that the U.S. government would falsely do something to convince the public to go to war, or that they would go to war knowing the reason they were doing so was untrue. Tying this back to 9/11, there's no evidence that 9/11 was a false flag operation, and I won't discuss other dubious details from 9/11 attacks, but the U.S. government did sure take a lot of action after 9/11 in the Middle East, many of it seemingly unjustified and excessive in hindsight.
My fellow citizens, at this hour, American and coalition forces are in the early stages of military operations to disarm Iraq, to free its people, and to defend the world from grave danger.
Let's not forget the $39.5 billion in Iraq war-related contracts awarded to Halliburton, of which Vice President Cheney was the CEO until his selection as Vice President.